The U.S. President Donald Trump has warned the Venezuelan president not to challenge the United States. At a press conference,
Nothing happened by accident, and that is what made this moment dangerous. At 6:12 a.m., in international waters south of the Caribbean Sea, a U.S. aircraft carrier was moving on a steady heading through open ocean under international law, with calm seas, clear visibility, and no unusual activity reported along its route, when the radar picture inside the carrier strike group began to change. Operators detected 5 surface contacts approaching from the southern sector, moving without AIS signals and without electronic identification, and their speed, alignment, and spacing immediately suggested coordination rather than coincidence. As tracking data improved, the contacts were identified as Venezuelan naval warships closing distance in a controlled formation that indicated deliberate intent. There were no warning shots and no public radio exchanges, but the atmosphere across the strike group tightened as readiness levels rose. Escort ships adjusted their spacing, and sensor coverage expanded to record every maneuver in real time. The carrier did not change course or speed, not out of hesitation, but in line with doctrine designed to prevent unnecessary escalation. This was not a navigation error and not a routine patrol drifting off course. It fit the pattern of a gray zone naval encounter, where pressure is applied without crossing the threshold of open conflict. At that moment, the issue was no longer proximity, but purpose, raising the question of whether this was simply another patrol or the first signal of something far more deliberate. And stay with us, like the video, and subscribe to Military Power, because what happens next matters to understand why this encounter unfolded the way it did. To grasp that, it is necessary to step back and look at the Caribbean as it exists today, not as a quiet transit zone, but as a region where military, political, and law enforcement missions increasingly overlap. In recent years, the Caribbean has become a focal point for U.S. security operations driven by 3 parallel pressures. Sustained counter-narcotics missions as maritime smuggling routes from South America continue to adapt. Economic and political tension tied to sanctions and diplomatic isolation that push certain regional actors to assert presence and visibility at sea, and a broader U.S. effort to maintain freedom of navigation and regional stability through persistent naval presence rather than short deployments. These factors have created an environment where warships, patrol aircraft, commercial vessels, and law enforcement assets operate close together, often in the same maritime corridors. And as traffic density increases, so does the risk of miscalculation, because a maneuver that looks routine in isolation can take on strategic meaning when executed near a major U.S. naval formation. This risk is not theoretical, as multiple verified reports in recent months have described near misses, aggressive maneuvers, and elevated alert levels involving military and civilian aircraft and vessels across the Caribbean and nearby airspace, underscoring the reality that when forces operate close to each other under political tension, the margin for error narrows fast. This is why gray zone confrontation is critical to understand, because it involves applying pressure without crossing legal or military lines that would justify an immediate armed response. No shots are fired, no weapons are locked, and no formal warnings are issued. Instead, intent is communicated through positioning, speed, formation, and silence, making this type of encounter more dangerous than open conflict because it thrives on ambiguity. In conventional engagements, rules and responses are clearer, but in the gray zone, every action is open to interpretation, and a single misjudgment can trigger consequences far beyond what either side intended. Approaching a warship this way, especially in international waters, forces commanders to choose between escalation and restraint, knowing that firing too early risks legitimacy, while waiting too long can weaken deterrence. That is why these encounters are not about who has more firepower, but about who controls tempo, information, and perception, and who documents events and shapes the narrative afterward. As the situation continued, the behavior of the 5 Venezuelan warships became harder to dismiss as normal navigation because they did not spread out or hold parallel courses, but advanced in a converging formation, remained silent on standard communication channels, and kept measured speeds with deliberate spacing, tightening angles like a closing net rather than a passing transit. In busy international waters, professional crews normally signal intent clearly, and here intent was communicated only through movement. Their discipline suggested centralized command, not confusion, ruling out misunderstanding or a lone ship acting independently. As minutes passed, the distance closed to under 5 nautical miles, a critical threshold at sea where maneuvering space shrinks and decisions carry immediate consequences. Nothing exploded and no alarm sounded, but tension rose minute by minute because both sides understood that at this range, every degree of turn and every knot of speed mattered, and silence itself had become a form of communication. For the Venezuelan ships, the approach applied pressure without triggering an automatic response. For the U.S. carrier strike group, it demanded restraint without giving up control. No line had been crossed, but both sides were close enough to feel exactly where that line was. And from that point forward, the confrontation was no longer defined by regional politics, but by what happened minute by minute on the surface of the sea. At this stage, silence stopped being passive and became deliberate control. Stabilized inside that narrow envelope, the encounter had reached a critical phase where the question was no longer whether the approach was intentional, because that was already clear, but what would happen next, whether this was the end point of a pressure maneuver meant only to observe and withdraw, or the setup for a further move after reactions were measured and recorded. Because at sea, what does not happen can matter as much as what does. As the 5 Venezuelan warships continued operating inside a tightening envelope, the response of the U.S. carrier strike group defied spectacle and expectation, because what mattered was not what the carrier did, but what it deliberately refused to do. The carrier held its course, speed, and heading with controlled consistency, not as hesitation, but as doctrine, since U.S. naval operations are designed to handle ambiguous approaches in international waters in ways that deny escalation opportunities. Turning away could be framed as retreat. Turning toward could be portrayed as provocation. So by maintaining its original track, the carrier removed both narratives at once. Around it, escort ships adjusted quietly rather than dramatically, expanding their protective screen through calculated spacing, increasing sensor overlap, reducing blind spots, sharpening tracking quality, and optimizing awareness rather than tightening in panic. Every Venezuelan movement was captured in real time, with course changes logged, speed adjustments timestamped, and formation geometry continuously mapped and cross-checked across multiple systems, turning observation into active documentation. Because in modern naval confrontations, data itself is leverage. Public signaling was deliberately avoided, with no broadcast challenges, no visible warnings, and no messages aimed at outside audiences, as communications remained internal and procedural. Since in gray zone encounters, messaging restraint matters as much as maneuver restraint. By refusing visible reaction, the strike group denied the approaching force the psychological payoff that pressure tactics often seek, where any sharp maneuver or public warning can be claimed as success. This restraint was not weakness, because the strike group retained overwhelming capability at every stage and simply chose not to spend it unnecessarily, understanding that preserved power is controlled power. Rules of engagement and standardized procedures converted ambiguity into structure, preventing individual judgment calls from driving escalation. And by holding course, the carrier shifted the burden of escalation entirely onto the approaching ships, ensuring that any further move would originate clearly from one side alone. As minutes passed, the surface situation remained unresolved while clarity grew beneath it, with data quietly accumulating into a detailed picture of intent, discipline, and command control, showing that silence, paired with awareness, can be pressure without force. As the encounter evolved, that awareness expanded upward when an E-2D Hawkeye launched from the carrier to extend detection beyond the horizon, acting as an airborne command node that fused radar, electronic surveillance, and surface tracking into a layered tactical picture. This allowed commanders to assess not just where the Venezuelan ships were, but how they moved, as course geometry revealed intent, speed consistency suggested planning, and spacing showed discipline, separating deliberate maneuver from routine patrol behavior. Like air traffic control in crowded skies, the strike group could now see flow instead of isolated contacts, anticipate movement rather than react to it, and confirmed that the Venezuelan ships were converging in ways that reduced maneuvering options while preserving formation integrity. At this point, The strike group was no longer merely observing events, but shaping them through anticipation, where each data update narrowed uncertainty, and control came not from visible action, but from disciplined silence backed by total awareness. By the time expectations replaced uncertainty, control had already shifted. This was the moment where technology turned directly into strategic leverage, because seeing earlier did not mean acting faster. It meant understanding intent before it became action, and choosing responses based on confidence instead of reaction. With a full aerial picture in place, the difference between routine naval presence and deliberate pressure was no longer subjective, it was measurable. And this awareness allowed the strike group to separate proximity from provocation. Because distance alone does not define a threat, behavior does. Routine patrols reveal themselves through consistency, while intentional pressure shows through adjustment. And as every movement was tracked and placed in context, ambiguity steadily collapsed. With the situation stabilized under complete surveillance, the next step followed doctrine that favors layered presence. First awareness, then confirmation, and only then visibility. Rather than escalating from the carrier itself, attention shifted to a platform designed for close observation and flexible signaling, and that choice was deliberate. A fixed-wing aircraft had already secured control of the wider environment, and now a rotary wing asset would address the immediate surface interaction. On the flight deck, preparations began to launch an MH-60 Seahawk, not as a show of force, but as a careful transition from distant awareness to direct observation, where timing, method, and message all mattered. Because once the helicopter lifted off, the encounter would move from prediction to presence, and from silent assessment to unmistakable visibility. The Seahawk launched smoothly under routine procedures, climbing to a stable altitude and approaching along a measured path that avoided any appearance of aggression, with its mission focused on observing and documenting rather than threatening. Its maritime sensors captured high-resolution imagery, tracked vessel movement, and confirmed identification while maintaining a safe standoff distance, remaining clearly visible to the Venezuelan ships, but well outside any range that could be framed as hostile. That balance was intentional, because in gray zone encounters, visibility removes speculation, and a clearly seen observer communicates certainty. With the aircraft overhead, the encounter was no longer limited to surface tracking, as every maneuver was now recorded, time-stamped, and preserved as part of an indisputable operational record. Communication followed the same restrained logic, with no confrontational broadcasts or public warnings, only standard maritime messages and clear visual cues that confirmed continuous observation rather than issued threats. From the Venezuelan perspective, the calculation began to change, because pressure through silence depends on ambiguity, and ambiguity disappears once observation becomes explicit. With airborne surveillance in place, any further convergence, sharp maneuver, or test of distance would be recorded from multiple angles and judged against established behavior patterns. Gradually, subtle shifts appeared as the previously tight formation loosened, courses adjusted outward instead of inward, speeds normalized, and converging vectors gave way to parallel movement, reducing the sense of enclosure without a single aggressive response from the strike group. These changes unfolded incrementally across the formation, indicating coordinated direction rather than spontaneous retreat, while the Seahawk remained on station, maintaining altitude and spacing, observing without crowding or pursuit to confirm that disengagement was real and sustained. Eventually, the Venezuelan vessels altered course decisively, increased separation, and moved away from the carrier's path, with no weapons activated, no warning shots fired, and no emergency actions required. The encounter ended quietly, with distance restored and intent clarified, not by force, but by controlled escalation and disciplined signaling. By introducing an aerial observer at the precise moment and in the correct manner, the United States turned ambiguity into clarity without provoking confrontation, reversing pressure through certainty rather than firepower. In gray zone operations, success is not defined by dramatic action, but by who forces the other side to adjust first. And in this case, the adjustment was clear as the Venezuelan formation disengaged and the carrier continued on its original course. From first radar contact to final separation, the sequence followed a clear arc. 5 warships approached in silence. The strike group held course, expanded awareness, documented every move. Airborne sensors completed the picture. Visible observation ended ambiguity, and distance was restored without shots fired or control surrendered. The lesson is simple but critical. American naval strength is not measured only in missiles, aircraft, or tonnage, but in discipline, doctrine, and the ability to manage escalation without losing credibility. In an era where a single misjudgment can spark wider conflict, restraint backed by awareness is not weakness, it is mastery. And this is why carrier strike groups remain instruments of stability, designed not just to fight wars, but to prevent them by making intentions visible, outcomes predictable, and consequences clear.